There we go. And we're going to get started in a few moments. We're going to have a lot of folks joining us today, I'm expecting, so I'm just kind of letting people in as they join. But again, I really appreciate you all being here for this conversation. Obviously, for those of you who are regulars at PHMass events, you know we've been talking a lot about the new code, both the new updated stretch code and the opt-in code. Just last month, we had Ian Finlinson and Paul Ormond from the DOER join us to give their perspective on the code rollout. That is available as a recording on our website. So if you missed it or want to go back and kind of see what they said, you can find that recording. They also spoke at our symposium last November as well. So a lot of our events, you know, you've heard a little bit about the code. Today, what we wanted to do is kind of take a back up from what the DOER is presenting and what the official code is, and actually talk about how this rollout is going for the towns and cities that are currently considering opting in. So we have representatives from 3 different municipalities tonight. On your screen, you can see Lisa Cunningham, who's from Brookline, one of the first towns to opt in to the new code. We also have Pat Hanlon from Arlington, who is in the process of considering the opt-in code right now. And we'll have Deb Crossley from the city of Newton, who just opted into the code last week. So we have 3 different perspectives coming from cities and towns that are either opted in already or are considering the process of it. And all 3 of our speakers are having great resources on this. I think sharing resources with other towns as well. So we'll have things to talk about that they've, conversations that they've been having with other towns as well. We'll start though with a quick overview of the code itself. So I'll kind of talk about the specialized opt-in code, what it is, and what are some of the past aspects of it before we turn things over. As just a reminder, as usual, please use the chat room to ask any questions or discuss, topics or make any comments that you like. At the end of after we sort of open up the panel discussion, we can let you guys ask questions directly. So you can use the raise hand feature and ask your question directly. But for now, just use the chat room and keep it all there. And if you want to turn on your screen and say hello, you're not obligated, but we'd love to see your face. So we're going to head and get started. So once again, thank you for joining us here at the PHMass March 2023 meeting on the specialized opt-in code experience so far. So let's start with a little background on the code itself. For a lot of you, this may be some familiar stuff, but it's good to just kind of give us a good so we're all on the same page on where we're coming from tonight. So the next generation of building codes. This is something we've been talking about for, over a year now at this point, is how the state has been drafting new building codes. So there was a bill that came through back in 2021, the next generation roadmap bill, that went through the state house and signed by the governor that mandated the drafting of a new energy code. And really the goal was to help the state meet its carbon reduction obligations. We have goals in the state for carbon reduction limits by 2030 and by 2050. And the whole idea behind the building code was to help our state hit those goals by requiring energy reductions at the building level. So the stretch code, which was first introduced over 10 years ago now and adopted by most communities in the state, has been updated to be a new stretch code that has stricter energy use limits, and an additional brand new code was introduced. And this is what this roadmap bill mandated, something called the next generation or net zero opt-in code. Now, whether the new code is a net zero code or not, we can save that for another day, but that's what they were asked to create. What they actually created, so this was the old code, the base energy code and the stretch code that was introduced about 10 years ago, a little over. So, but this is the new code. This is what exists now. So we have the base energy code, the stretch code, which again is an automatic update. So for the vast majority of communities in the state that are stretch code communities, this isn't something that you choose to opt into. This just automatically, the stretch code becomes this new updated stretch code. But on top of that, we have the new specialized opt-in code. And this is what communities are opting into right now, or what they're deciding whether or not to opt into. So think of this, so we kind of have 3 layers of codes. I actually like this graphic showing it a little bit better, because it's good to kind of think of these as layers on top of one another. You have the base code, which applies everywhere, and then the stretch code kind of goes on top of that. And it addresses many things, but things that the stretch code doesn't address, the base code does. And then the opt-in code goes on top of that and adds some new requirements that you have to meet. And it doesn't address everything. The things that it doesn't address, you default back down to the stretch code or the base code as required. So you can kind of think of them as layers on top of one another. So this is the timeline. We're already in the winter spring here for 2023, but this is where things have been going. Those of you who have been attending our meetings regularly know that we've kind of been talking about this from the very beginning of this timeline. But right now we're on this winter spring mix where certain things have been rolled out. Other phase-in dates for parts of the code will come in the middle of this year, in July 1st. And then other things won't come in until 2024. So I have some other charts here in a little bit that'll kind of go into that more specifically. But it's good to know that while the code's been rolled out, most of the actual requirements of the code are going to kind of take a little bit of time throughout this next year to roll out. But for the purpose of tonight's meeting, the biggest thing to note is that communities can now start opting in to the specialized code. They were able to do that at the beginning of the year. So let's go over just kind of quick updates on what the code is. I'm going to quickly talk about the stretch code before I move down to the opt-in code. Very, very quickly, this isn't meant to be a full presentation on the code. Again, for those who missed last month's meeting, definitely check out our website for the session from the DOER on their presentation on the code, and stick around for the questions they asked that are part of that video. There's some really good content on it that you can kind of learn all about the code if you want to get kind of a deep dive into it. But the biggest things the stretch code did, the new stretch code, is it's putting kind of tighter energy restrictions. So it's putting these HERS requirements. And I'll talk about the HERS score in just a moment for those unfamiliar with it. But it's requiring buildings to actually meet a HERS score, HERS rating. So for most buildings, that's going to be either HERS 45 or HERS 42, depending on if you're an all-electric building or if you're going to be using fossil fuels. And I'll show what that means here in a little bit. But the important thing, I think, for this group is that passive house is another pathway. You can simply build a passive house building, have it certified, and you can meet the stretch code that way. Now, for commercial buildings, there's kind of a lot more things that the stretch code introduced, things like other petty energy limits that you may be hearing things about. We're not going to talk too much about that today. We'll see what questions you guys have on it, and maybe we'll get into it that way. But again, the important thing to know is that even for commercial projects, passive house is an approved pathway. You can try to meet the HERS requirements or the petty limits that have been introduced, or you can simply build a passive house. Which, as a reminder, and I don't think this group needs it, but passive house, despite the name, applies to all building types, not just residential, but commercial buildings, offices, mixed-use buildings, schools, all different types of buildings can be passive house. So let's get into the specialized opt-in code, because that's really what we're talking about tonight. And that's what communities are considering right now, is should they opt into this new code that goes above and beyond the stretch code. So let's talk about kind of what the opt-in code does. What does it change? So the first thing for residential projects you're seeing here. So it's going to require all electric HERS 45 score buildings or passive house. So that's kind of one pathway. You can also make a mixed fuel pathway, which requires you to be a HERS 42 score building, or again, a passive house building. You'll kind of see that theme. You can meet the HERS score, or you can meet the passive house score. The biggest change for the opt-in code, and the thing that we've sort of been talking with a lot of these communities about, is the impact it has on multifamily housing. Because that's where the biggest difference from the stretch code to the opt-in code comes into place. Is that for the opt-in code, it's a requirement for large multifamily buildings to meet the passive house standard. Everything else I was just briefly talking about was about different pathways. You can meet the HERS score, or you can meet the passive house score. When it comes to these large multifamily buildings, you're required to meet passive house. It's no longer one of the pathways, it's the pathway. So for a lot of these opt-in, a lot of the communities that are considering this is one of the biggest questions they have. Is what's going to be the impact for multifamily buildings, as this is the biggest change. Now, I mentioned a lot about HERS, so I did want to kind of throw in one little slide here just to cover what it means to have a HERS rating for those who are kind of new to the concept. HERS is the Home Energy Rating System. And what it does, it was introduced many, many years ago to sort of compare energy use between typical buildings and new buildings. And when it was started, the idea is that a typical reference home, your typical existing home, will be a 100 on the score. Really poor buildings that use more energy than they should would be a higher score, and better performing buildings would be a lower score. And as you got down to a 0, that would be considered a zero energy building, would be a 0 on the score. So it's not a measure of total energy use. So say a 25 or a 50 on the score doesn't translate to a certain amount of kBTUs or something of energy that you're using. It's simply a relative score to compare buildings to one another. The base code, the old base code recommended, or the old stretch code had a 55 on the scale. So if you kind of look to the left, you can, or on the right of this image, where the code used to be, it was right around a 55. That new stretch code is going to require you to be at a 45 or 42, depending on if you're all electric or mixed fuel. And then you can see this note about passive house. So passive house doesn't require a HERS score. It's not part of the passive house process, but typically you will find passive house projects are going to be a max of about a 32 on the HERS score. So building a passive house, you're building not only a better performing building, but you don't actually even have to go through the HERS process because passive house is that different pathway. So here's some quick comparison charts, and we can make these slides available. In fact, I'll show you a link in a little bit that has some of our resources on these. This comes from some resources that NEAP has put together, and I have links for those as well. So they're fantastic resources for these things. But this is a comparison between the stretch code and the opt-in code, just so you can get an idea of, again, what are the differences between the two of them. And you can see in residential, there's not a whole lot of big differences, especially when passive house comes into play. Passive house is a pathway. It's something you can choose to do in the stretch code for all building types. For multifamily residential, this again is where that biggest difference is, and this really highlights it. Under the multifamily stretch code, you can see there's lots of variations that you can do with HERS ratings or passive house. When it comes to the municipal opt-in stretch code, passive house is it. And then you have, of course, commercial. And with commercial, there's not a huge difference between stretch code and the opt-in code. And I think the biggest thing to kind of take away here for passive house, at least, is that passive house, once again, is an alternative pathway. You can do these other performance requirement methods, or you can go through the passive house certification process for a commercial building. So you can do either, but passive house is very appropriate for commercial buildings. You can use it. Here we are so far. So this is showing you the map of all the towns that have opted in so far. So first of all, the light blue color are all the stretch code communities. So all the stretch code communities are automatically part of the updated stretch code. But the dark blue ones there, you can see kind of the call out square there where it zooms in, showing you the 5 communities that have now opted in to the updated stretch code. So Brookline, Watertown, Cambridge, Somerville, and Newton. Newton is the newest. They just opted in last week. So we're now up to 5. Now, the one thing to keep in mind about this is the rollout period. Just because these towns or cities opted in doesn't mean the opt-in code starts immediately. There's about a 6-month minimum grace period for this until it kicks in. So for the first 4 towns that opted in, Brookline, Cambridge, Somerville, and Watertown, the opt-in code will go into effect July 1st of this year. For the towns that will be opting in kind of in the next few weeks or so, as well as Newton that just opted in last week, it will go into effect at the beginning of next year, January 1st, 2024. So for example, Arlington is going to be speaking today. Pat from Arlington will be talking about their process. If they choose to opt in, I imagine it will go into effect in January 1st of 2024. But for those first towns, it goes into effect this coming July. So the questions that we get at Passive House Massachusetts a lot about this are, what is the impact on multifamily buildings and specifically on affordable housing? We get a lot of questions on. And again, those of you who have been attending a lot of our sessions in the past sort of know that this has been a large focus of Passive House and Passive House Massachusetts, because we've seen a large growth in multifamily developments already. Even before the code went into effect, we're seeing this is the biggest area where Passive House is growing in the state is multifamily and even in affordable housing. So what you're seeing at the top part is the incremental costs. This is data that's been shared quite a bit from the Mass CEC, but it's showing you about a 1 to 3% cost premium for multifamily projects. And this is something that honestly we expect to continue to drop. All these projects came through the Passive House Design Challenge, which was issued in 2018. So we're several years past that already, and we expect newer projects to be even have a lower cost premium, not 1 to 3% level. The other part that I've talked about in the past, if you attended these meetings, are incentives are available. We have excellent incentives from Mass Save for passive house projects. There's incentives for affordable housing projects through the low income tax or low income funding program. So you get passive house projects get greater consideration in those programs. So there's lots of great incentives out there. And something worth noting, the chart you're seeing at the bottom here is showing you the Mass Save incentive program and the number of projects enrolled by number of units. And what you're seeing is that currently enrolled, we have over 10,000 units worth of projects currently enrolled in those incentive programs, which is incredible. And that's before the code went into effect. None of these projects were doing it because they were required to do it. All of these are ones that are doing it because they chose to do it. And of those projects, 40% of them are documented as low income affordable housing projects. So if you ask kind of what is the impact of multifamily projects, what's the impact of affordable housing, what we've seen is that passive house has been a boost to both of those things already. And many projects are already, choosing to be passive house before they've been even required to do it. At the same time, these costs are getting lower and lower over time. We're kind of in an influx period here over the last several years, in many part because of these incentives, but we're seeing a wider variety of project teams, different types of architecture firms and developers take on these projects, newer construction companies and GCs who are now doing this. And we're having, greater expertise. We're also seeing the market growth in terms of vendors and suppliers. So whether it's windows or rigid insulation, we're seeing a greater amount of products being manufactured locally. This is all helping to drop the cost. So when I talk about the incremental cost coming down, these are many great reasons. And we expect this code process, as this sort of rolls out and we start to see more and more passive house projects go into development, that this is going to continue to happen and these costs are going to continue to come down. We also expect there to be some new incentives coming out as part of the Federal Inflation Reduction Act incentives. That's a whole nother kind of session, a whole other topic to talk about, but it is something that there's a whole bucket sort of there that we expect. So that's sort of the story, if you want, from the passive house front, is that we already have multifamily projects doing this. We already have affordable housing projects doing this long before they were required to do. And PHMass, this is sort of where we've been as a resource. We've sort of see ourselves as a resource communities and the local hub of expertise on passive house. So we want to be an expertise. We're not here to talk about how the entire code works, but we want to be able to let all the new folks who are experiencing passive house for the first time now know what it is. And so we've been speaking to various town meetings and other gatherings. We have training courses that are available that folks can get from us. We're helping to also connect people with other training resources that are out there and put together sessions like we have tonight, where we can learn from some folks who have gone through this process or are going through it right now to share some of their expertise. So do not be afraid to reach out. I know with tonight's meeting, we definitely have folks here from towns that are in the process of considering this. Feel free to reach out to the speakers you're going to hear tonight and reach out directly to us. We can be a resource on this. We can help you. We can help the folks in your town to understand what passive house is and what the impacts it will have. Here's some resources that you can go to. All of these are available as links on our site, phmass.org. But you can find some great ones here. There's stuff directly from the DOER on the code, so you can get the official language on the top. If you go down to those ones from NEEP, those kind of comparison charts that I was referencing, those come from those NEEP files. So those are really great resources. And I was just shared with something from Demilla Schaefer on one of their blogs. They have this really excellent map where they're putting together and kind of tracking the progress of communities as they go through this. Excellent resource, and I think you guys should look at that as well. But there's some really good resources out there. But again, you can find all of this linked from our website, phmass.org. So that's sort of my introduction and what I wanted to open up today with, to just kind of get some background on the specialized code. As I mentioned during that, we currently have 5 communities or towns or cities that are part of this opt-in code that already decided, and there's numerous other ones that are considering it. So tonight we wanted to welcome some special guests from some of these communities to kind of talk through this process so far and answer your questions. So we have Lisa Cunningham here as a representative of Brookline, who is one of the first towns to opt into this. She is also a part of the Zero Carbon MA group, which has been instrumental in helping other communities kind of deal with this challenge. So she's going to be speaking from both of those fronts. We have Pat Hanlon from the town of Arlington, who's in the process of going through the opt-in code right now, deciding whether or not to opt in. And we have Deb Crossley from the city of Newton, who, as we mentioned, just opted in last week. So 3 excellent speakers. What I'm going to do is kind of ask each of them to give a little opening statement here, just introduce themselves and give a little update on where their town or city is in this process right now, and then we'll start taking some questions. So Lisa, how about you jump in here?
Sure. Thank you, Erin. Really appreciate it. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Great. Nice to see everybody here this evening. I'm an architect and a co-founder of the nonprofit Zero Carbon MA. And I'm also one of the co-petitioners who introduced and passed the first gas prohibition on the East Coast in 2019 in Brookline. And we spent the past 3.5 years trying to pass fossil fuel-free legislation in Brookline through various mechanisms. And hopefully this May town meeting, we will be able to join the demonstration project that was set up under the 2022 climate bill. Brookline is on a town meeting schedule where we have town meetings in May and October, November. And so in order to enact the specialized code as soon as possible, with paying deference to DOER's 6-month lead time, we called a special town meeting in early January. And we passed specialized code, I would say, pretty easily in our community, since we have been working on these issues for a while. I would say that my advice in passing the specialized code in your community is to focus on the very small, incremental, but very important differences between the specialized and the stretch code. We don't need to teach what the stretch code is about. It's very difficult for people to understand. There are just a small key difference, few key differences. They're very important differences. And basically they focus around consumer protection, basically protecting the citizens of your town from future expensive retrofits, from unhealthy buildings, and from volatile fossil fuel prices. So the other thing that I was going to say too is that when we went to pass our legislation, there were already towns who had started to hold meetings, such as Newton and Wellesley. And they had already generated materials that were really, really useful, that we found very useful to replicate and use in our own presentations. So as a result of that, at Zero Carbon MA, we've established a resources folder where other communities can access all these presentations from other communities. They can research slides, they can look at PowerPoints that have been used, presentations. So I'll stick that folder in the chat. It's been a great tool for other communities to use. And every time a new community comes forward with a presentation, that gets put in the folder. So it's really a great folder of resources. And then since there are a lot of communities that have done this, it's also an opportunity for people to be able to reach out to people in these communities to get help. Because there are plenty of people who are waiting by to help. And I also wanted to add that we have an informal tracker of communities. So yes, there are 5 communities that have passed. 4 are going to be implementing the specialized code in July of 2023, and the latest one, Newton, in January of 2024. But we know that there's an additional 22 communities, bringing that total to 27, that are in the queue mostly for this year, and that these communities represent over 20% of the state's population. And I'm guessing by building activity, they represent significantly more than that. So we want to keep this rolling. The fact that we've been able to crowdsource these resources, I think it's been super useful. And I want to thank everybody for being here tonight, and for Passive House for giving us this opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And we'll talk a lot more about some of those resources here as the night goes on. Pat Hanlon, how about you jump in here next from Arlington?
Okay, so I'm Pat Hanlon. I'm the vice chair of Sustainable Arlington, and in one way or another, I've been working on this issue ever since we got in line behind Brookline to do the initial fossil fuel free ban. We have been following this issue throughout the regulatory process, so it didn't really come out as a surprise to us. And we've taken a position on several different occasions, both through our then town manager and through resolutions by town meeting, advocating a specialized stretch code that is considerably more draconian than this one is. So we're dealing with a context in which Arlington has already been, if you measure this by left or right, which is a funny way of doing it, but it's way far to the left of where what we're trying to do now, which creates a potential problem, figuring out why it is we should support this when something else is what we wanted. But it's a problem that's nice to have. Arlington is different from Brookline in a lot of respects. One of which is it has one of the lowest rates of new construction in the Commonwealth. And it is by far the lowest rate of new construction of anyone in the group of towns that we typically compare ourselves with. It's an old town. Most of the average age of a house in Arlington is the average year built is 1926. So there's been a continual process of renovations and so forth. There's also speckling, really, but in the public mind, much more than a speckling of building large new houses, which everybody except the people who paid multi-million dollars to buy them loves to hate. So that, plus the history of the issue and the fact that we have a very good relationship with the town officials from the town, both the town manager, the select board, and so forth, puts us in a situation where there are hurdles that some other towns have to address that Arlington does not. We also are a representative town meeting, so we're not trying to get as many people as we can to town meeting. It doesn't work that way. It's not like a caucus. There are actually 252 people that we know who they are. We know where they live, and we're coming after them. And part of our strategy is to make certain that we have people in every precinct who are making calls and sending emails and talking with their precinct representatives. We know for many of them what they've done on earlier versions of the electrification issue. So we're starting with quite a bit of knowledge about who it is we need to persuade. The first agency up is the select board, which again has been supportive up to now, and we have no reason to believe that it won't be supportive in the future. But it's critical because at town meeting, the initial motion comes from the select board recommendation. So if we suddenly somehow tripped over the select board stage and got a no action recommendation or even a mixed recommendation, suddenly instead of course, Arlington is going to be adopting the specialized code. It's wait a minute, what's going on here? And that leads me to the next major problem that you have, and that is the same thing that Lisa started with. This isn't about the stretch code. And we try really hard not to talk about the stretch code. And the biggest enemy we have in a place like Arlington, where people are already pretty much on our side, the very biggest enemy is that once you begin talking about the stretch code, they get so incredibly confused that it's very difficult to make the case that you need to make, which is to get town meeting to do the only thing that town meeting can do, because town meeting has no jurisdiction whatever over whether the stretch code applies. So the idea is to simplify, simplify, simplify. And it's hard to simplify even the specialized stretch code, but it's easier than it is if you deal with all of it. So we typically have a very complicated slide that we got from Wellesley, which has in red or green the things where it's different. And we say, don't read this, just look at the places where it's either red or green. That's the only thing you have to consider. And that helps. It doesn't help completely, but it helps a lot. In Arlington, we don't have that new construction, so most people don't think of the specialized stretch code as applying to them personally. And that is the advantage of renovations not being covered. The disadvantage is that we want all the people who are doing the gut renovations to be subject to it, which they're not now under the proposed stretch code, but we are potentially a part of the demonstration program, and that's what we sought 3 years ago, and that's going to be an important part of something that will come up for us in the fall when we decide how we're going to change our initial bylaw in order to participate in the program. The main pitch that we have, I'll get to the multifamily in a second, but the main pitch here is really that DOER hated mandates. And they were told probably to hate mandates, but in any event, they hated them. But they didn't mind putting their thumbs on the scales in order to try to get people to do voluntarily what we would have liked to have made people do. And so much of the building performance stuff here, whether it's HRSA or whether it's Passive House, is designed to encourage people voluntarily to electrify, and to electrify in a fairly extreme way. That is to say, everything, including appliances and cooking and things that were originally exempted from some of the fossil fuel free bylaws. And so the electrification is the corollary to the high building performance. The electrification is also a corollary in a different way, in that if you're all electric, you don't have to do a lot of the building performances things that you otherwise would have to do. So you are in a situation where it's always easier and sometimes economically incredible not to go electric. And so that is an important part of the thing. You're building better houses in order to reduce the demand for energy, and you're reducing the demand for energy, but requiring this extra expense to build whatever it is that you're doing in order to say, forget all that, let's do electric, let's bring ourselves closer to net zero. So the second related thing is that the consumer protection part, if that's one way of looking at it, it's to facilitate retrofitting, whether people want to register someday to do this or whether they'll have to someday do that. Retrofitting is in the picture. It's electrification is the policy of the state. You want to put yourself in the situation where that's the least cost way of doing it, and you don't have resistance to possible mandates later on by people saying, wait a minute, I've got this gas and it's not at the end of its useful life yet. And that too is a big aspect of the appeal overall of the specialized stretch code. Now in Arlington, we have one thing that the kind of people who tend to support a vigorous electrification policy also tend to be activists, as I am actually, for affordable housing. And that's where Passive House especially comes in, and it comes in two ways. One is that the one thing that could really derail us is if it turned out that people could make a plausible case that it would interfere with building affordable housing in Arlington. And we recently have had a presentation, which Aaron participated in, which emphasized that we're already building a Passive House. The newest proposal of the major builder of affordable housing in Arlington has voluntarily offered a Passive House program. The incentives make that increasingly sensible for people who are building affordable housing, and in some sense hard to avoid. And so it isn't going to interfere, which is an important defensive point for us to make. But there's also an environmental justice point here. If you think about it in terms of affordable housing, what's wrong with building housing which will be cheaper to heat down the road, and that will be a more healthy building, and that will be a building that is more comfortable to live in? What is the point of saying you should have less than that? When the other people who can afford it are paying more money in order to be able to have the benefit of those sorts of things. So the Passive House mandate, which incidentally is one of the very few mandates in this whole process, the Passive House mandate can be justified not just because of the effect it has on greenhouse gas emissions, but also the effect it has on the quality of life of low and moderate income people who are moving into affordable housing. And that is an important point for us, both defensively, but even more shifting onto the front foot and emphasizing how this fits into the equity objectives that the town has. So I'll stop there. We'll answer questions later on about how this process acts.
All right. Oh, thanks, Pat. No, that was great. And I like the point that both you and Lisa are making on both whether it's consumer protection or environmental justice. I mean, these things are very much similar in that there's lots of reasons to do this beyond energy reduction. I want to welcome our third speaker here, Deb Crossley, City Councilor of Newton, who they just passed this through City Council last week. So Deb, thanks for being here. I know you came to us from another obligation, so I'm glad you were able to make it. And please jump in and tell us a little bit about yourself briefly, I think, for folks who don't know who you are, and then just a little bit about kind of where Newton is on this process and what you went through getting it passed last week.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Deb Crossley. I am also an architect, but I've been a city councilor for the city of Newton, used to be called alderman. Now we're city councilor, same thing, for 13 years now. And I want to say, though, first of all, that in 2009, I'm very proud that the city of Newton was the first to adopt the stretch code in the state of Massachusetts. And I worked with a fellow named Jonathan Kantar, who the two of us were advocates, not official in any capacity, but we had some great folks. The stars aligned for us, and we had one of the aldermen on our side, and we're able to get a unanimous vote on the first night in committee and on the first meeting of the city council. If you don't know, the city of Newton has a very large city council, but maybe not as difficult as town meeting. We have 24 councilors, and we make the final decision, but we get input. We have a very active citizenry, and we get input from all corners. So we do have to pay attention to a much larger group. So I'm hugely in favor of moving the needle as far and as fast as we can on building standards. I see no excuse, either intellectually or actually, for not building anything we build new. Should strive for net zero, if not achieve net zero. It's only 1% of the construction that happens in the state of Massachusetts in any given year, but over 27 years, that'll be 27% built new or substantially renovated. I want to talk mostly just focus on the process, and I think why we were able to get this voted when we did. First, I want to just underline, we have a lot of passionate activists in our community, and that has led our land use committee to require very strict standards for new construction that are under their purview. The Green Newton Building Standards Committee, and you probably have heard about that from Betsy Harper, who I know couldn't be here tonight, but is one of your leaders, has been really a very successful force but doing it in a way that I think is.
Deb, you muted yourself.
Sorry, Green Building Standards Committee. I don't know how I did that. Anyway, never mind. Been very effective in their advocacy for better building standards that our council has now imposed upon large new developments. And Passive House has become, for larger projects, you might all know that our Northland project is going to be mostly passive house. Well, now it will be probably all passive house, but even before this passed, the specialized code, they were deciding to make 764 of their 800 residential units in the large residential blocks passive house certified. And this has been something that has resonated with our development community, mostly because of the teachings of the Green Newton Building Standards Committee. So we listened to them. And they had a lot to do with helping me to put together speakers, for example, who came in and spoke to the city council from their large base of knowledge. We also have folks who are concerned about these kinds of changes and the how it imposes on day-to-day operations, particularly from the business community, the Newton Chamber of Commerce. And although we're very fortunate to have Ann Berwick as our co-director of sustainability, who is the reason why you had materials coming from Newton early on. She started working on this last fall to help try to make sense of the stretch code before we even were sure of everything that was in it, right? The business community, I think, really needed to have separate conversations with us over a period of time so that they could clearly understand, how this was going to impact them. So although we needed to hone our message for the city council and get people to focus on the difference between the stretch code and the specialized code, the narrow differences as the other two folks have spoken to, we also felt it was really important to be straightforward and out there with the stakeholders who are most affected by this stuff for a period of time in advance. So if that's a helpful nugget of advice for any other community, I think it's worthwhile going outside your decision-making body and to the folks who are going to be directly impacted by the costs of some of this. And I want to say too that we did have just one meeting. We had a committee of the whole, so that's all city councilors instead of just doing it in the zoning and planning committee, so that everybody could hear this at once. And Ian Finlayson came to speak to us, which was a tremendous help. Nonetheless, I would say 75% of the comments we got from councilors, both before and after folks testified, were not about the specialized code, but about how difficult the stretch code has been. And the reason why is because there was no 6-month, I'll call it a grace period. Understanding that the AG's office ruled it unlawful to hold a concurrency period, which is how we're used to having the code offered, didn't mean that you could make everything effective on day one and you weren't going to have any problems, because it takes time for people to learn. Our inspectional service, and this is a piece of advice for every other community, to really observe that 6 months grace period recommended by DOER. Your inspectional services department will need that time to get up to speed. And your building community, your stakeholders, unlike Arlington, we actually have quite a lot of construction projects either underway or approved and waiting for the economy to straighten itself out, hopefully. So we have potentially a great deal of construction going on. And we started hearing from citizens who have their projects caught in the middle between December and January and February. A lot of them, and they're architects, and so counselors were getting calls, and you can imagine a lot of counselors, no other counselors are architects, some are planners, some are in real estate, but most counselors are not familiar with building code because we don't have anything to say about it normally. And at the end of the day, the city council realized we don't have anything to say about the stretch code. This is the state rule. This is how it happened. It was bad form, but all we're looking at is that difference between the stretch code and the specialized code, which isn't that big a difference, as folks have already described. So I guess understanding the differences between the two codes we felt was critical to getting our council to understand what it was we were doing, and being honest with the stakeholders, being proactive with the stakeholders was really important, I think, the chamber did not oppose this. They were fine with it. Once everybody really understood what it was that we were doing. So the other thing that factored into this is we understand we have to have the specialized code adopted in order, we are poised, if we can meet the affordability requirements, which we expect to meet this summer. And we got our fingers crossed that that project will actually get through the ZBA. But that we have to have these specialized code adopted ahead of or concurrently with our adoption of an ordinance to participate in 10 communities so that we can regulate electrification of new construction and substantial renovation. So that also played a role in, the city council has been talking about electrification ordinances and then becoming the home rule petition and then becoming part of 10 communities for well over 2 years now. And so folks did understand that that was a factor for us. And there we have it. We're going to have this in place on July 1st.
All right, that's fantastic. Thank you. All three of you gave some really, really good overview, some really good information on your thought process and all of this and how you're working it. So I have some questions to follow up on that, but I want to make sure everyone gets their questions answered as well. So there's already been some discussion going in the chat room. Please continue that. You can put questions there, but you can also use the raise hand feature of Zoom. So you can do that and let me know that you want to ask a question directly. You can unmute and do that. So after I call on you, so please use the raise hand feature if you got it. But we do have some questions going in the chat room already. But for all of you, I mean, I think all of you highlighted the fact that the biggest changes the new code have made has come in the stretch code itself, but not in the opt-in code. So I'm curious how much you are debating the stretch code itself, which it sounds like for the most part, many of you are, you're not, you're kind of saying you don't have that's something that you don't have a decision in anyway, it's automatic. And then how you're walking the line between saying that there's not much different about the opt-in code, at the same time trying to sell the benefits of the opt-in code to your communities. Has that been any challenge? Are you kind of finding that? I guess I get worried that if you downplay the differences with the opt-in code, that you also are downplaying the benefits of opting in the first place. And it makes folks feel, why should we decide? Has that been a challenge that you've been facing, or how are you kind of walking that line? Lisa,
Well, it is
unmuted here.
I'm sorry, it is a challenge, and all of us are in the same position. We all expect eventually to be part of the demonstration project.
Mm-hmm.
The way we've been dealing with it is that the specialized code is one step along the way.
Mm-hmm.
It's a step that we have to take for the reason that Deb said, to be able to be part of the demonstration project. And the demonstration project is what town meeting has already sought. So it's all part of a process, and there'll be a process beyond that as things get tightened up and things are reviewed. But you can't get to your destination until you take the first step, and this is the first step.
Yeah, I just want to come back to the fact that this actually affords your community protections. We know that we're actually in the stretch code and the specialized code, we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg, really. And we know that we're not actually complying with our state mandated targets. We have a state mandated target to reduce our carbon emissions by 50% by the year 2030. That's in 7 years, and we're still going in the wrong direction. We're digging the hole deeper. And so the specialized code doesn't even get us from digging the hole deeper. So we need to expand the quote unquote demonstration project to every community that wants to join. Right now, it is restricted to the first 10 communities. It's on a first come, first served basis. That's not fair. We've got big EJ communities like Boston and Somerville and Salem and also Northampton who are waiting in the wings. There's others who want to pass because communities want to be able to achieve their own climate goals. And right now, the state actually has no plan by which to achieve our own climate targets. We've written a 2020 plan, we've written a 2030 plan, we've written a 2050 plan, and we are not achieving those scientifically viable mandates. So this is something like has to be presented as, what is our alternative? Do we allow people to install asbestos and lead pipes in their house still? No. Why are we allowing people to put in fossil fuel systems? That's crazy. So again, we just get back to the fact that you are protecting your communities by passing the specialized code. And this is only the first step of what we need to do statewide.
I think that's a fantastic point. So this, I think, Pat, what you're hitting on, and Lisa, what you're kind of echoing, is that this is one step in a process that your towns have already been involved in for a while. Whether you've set stricter climate reduction targets compared to what the state has set, or you would like to set them, this is a path to get you there. Even if it doesn't get you there, this is a step there. And because you want to be part of the fossil fuel program, this is almost a requirement to be part of it. So kind of positioning the opt-in code as just one step to get to where your town actually wants to be. This isn't the destination, but this is one more step on the way.
So
I'm curious.
One of the points that was made hard among the speakers at our public hearing was that we adopted a climate action plan in the city of Newton in 2019. And this is simply, building standards are simply one of the key and essential elements of such a plan. So within that context, as well as wanting to be part of 10 communities, why we want to be part of 10 communities is because of our climate action plan. So, you can't adopt a climate action plan and then fail to take every opportunity to check the boxes.
Great. So there's some questions coming up in the chat here. A lot kind of about that, how this is going to impact like building inspections and how. So I guess there's, you've kind of been involved in the chat answering some of those questions, but I would ask you, especially to Lisa and Deb, now that this has been passed in your town, the discussion of whether to do it or not is over. What does the next 6 months or so look like until this goes into effect? And how do you see, your role in the town as helping to educate building inspectors or trades or others to make sure that when July 1st hits, they're ready to go?
That's not normally our role, but I have been, and others have been, sending notices of trainings. Again, the rollout of the stretch code has been a problem. I think I've just seen in the last week the first stretch code trainings available of any sort. I think I saw Nick Falkoff on this call, and I know that he has a training developed for builders, but I think he's looking for funding. And so Nick, it was too bad you didn't come and get to ask that yourself at our public hearing of Ian Finlayson, just to plant that seed. But again, training is really important for the industry. You cannot overemphasize how important it is. And although we can't go fast enough to abate climate change or try to get to a point where we try to arrest it, think of how fast this new material is coming for the folks who have to actually implement it on the ground. If you think, I've been in this arena since the 1970s, and didn't it take 20 years to raise the insulation level of your basic home construction, because the NAHB fought back against the idea that they had to go to a 2x6 frame construction from 2x4. Didn't it take 20 years to get that done? I don't remember the numbers, and a lot of people have calculated based on how much housing was developed, how much energy was wasted as a result. So right now, although I totally agree with Lisa about, we can't do enough fast enough, and but we have to implement these changes in a way that they can be absorbed by the community who's responsible to put them in place.
Nick, you have your hand up. Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, just responding. So the Newton building commissioner and the plans examiner were on the city council call that Deb was talking about, and they had an interesting take. So they interpret with the new codes, they're going to be checking the checkers, and they said we already checked the checkers when it comes to structural. You already have to have a HERS rating for a new house. So I think I saw there's a question in the chat box about, like, what's the inspector's reaction? They're just going to view, like with Passive House, they're going to have somebody else, a third party, checking all this work, and that's going to take the load off of them. So in some ways, I think that's interesting. I'm a little bit concerned. I'm not sure, because HERS rating is less strict and it's not as like regimented. I think there's going to be some questions about how does the HERS work get checked, especially as envelopes get dialed up. So the course we're working on now with the Northeast HERS Rater Association is like a HERS 42 course, which we'll hopefully have in like 6 to 8 weeks, which is like, what are all the things you have to be aware of with that? Yeah, but if there's funding available, then like it would be great to have a lot of courses developed, because it is a slow rollout right now, and there's a lot of questions and not a lot of support. So hopefully funding will become available to develop more trainings.
Great. And I know people on this call as well. I can see your names, folks from some of the other organizations out there, familiar with Passive House, who are developing trainings both in-house and for others. So there are going to be, I think, growing resources. This question of building inspectors, it has come up in other trainings I presented as well, and other conversations I've been part of. I just know there's a lot of concern out there about how we can get folks up to speed. And I do like what you hit it on, and what some of the others mentioned about how there is now going to be a third party sort of part to this, which I think, if you're unfamiliar with Passive House, you might not be aware that is going to relieve part of your burden. And I think a lot of what, say, a building inspector is afraid they have to get up to speed on is something that they don't. That's something that a Passive House verifier will, say, take care of. So that's kind of one comment there. There are some other comments in the chat room about costs. I know there's going back and forth about the percentage of cost increase. Just to clarify, the numbers that I shared, 1 to 3%, were new construction, multifamily affordable housing projects. There was a comment about a renovation. Renovations are kind of all over the map in terms of cost increase, so that number doesn't apply to them. But in terms of what the specialized opt-in code is requiring, large multifamily buildings to go Passive House, the data we've seen is in that 1 to 3% range. Michelle, is that a hand? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So while I have had, I don't know you, but I'm soon to move to Arlington from Somerville. We're doing a deep energy retrofit on our home and going all electric, and hopefully moving in this weekend if luck will have it. So I work in the large scale multifamily world. I'm an architect. And I think on the new construction side, it's honestly not that hard. We know how to do it well at this point, and we should be doing it right. When it comes to existing buildings and how to upgrade them for the first time in 50 plus years, hopefully to last another 50 plus years, it's a really big question. And I am interested in how communities are thinking holistically across city departments and organizations, whatever those look like, to have this conversation so that everyone's steering in the right direction or in the same direction, and understanding the tussle points, like, for example, being historically relevant, or in a historic district, or just subject to other reviews that maybe don't have the full memo on how the city has made these commitments and what that looks like. And I think it's critical that there is a less siloed approach and that we get all the relevant players together when we're talking about buildings, whether it's renovation or new construction, so that they are having the right conversations to understand how we wrestle with these choices.
So I think that's a well taken, and we try. It's within what is immediately within the domain of the town manager. It works a lot better. I sit on the zoning board of appeals, and in 40B projects, we have taken to increase the number of agencies that are consulted, one of which is the Clean Energy Futures Committee. And in the last 3 40Bs, we've emerged, or at least with all electric projects in 2 of them. And a lot of that has to do with being more systematic about consulting various town departments. So we're doing better. It's not, but all is a very big standard.
It's,
And
yeah,
we
no.
don't do
I
all,
can't.
but we
Yeah.
do better, and it helps. We have an electrification program for retrofits that's voluntary but providing assistance. So we're going along that way. A lot of it tends to be concentrated in our planning department, so that it comes on one or a few people who are actively involved in most of the things that are going on. But it's a challenge. It certainly is a challenge, and we try to do better.
Thank you.
So there's a good comment in the chat here about kind of a switch to fossil fuels, which isn't necessarily, opt-in code oriented, but it is part of this conversation about how much of the grid, if we're switching from fossil fuels to all electricity, isn't the grid mostly fossil fuels and so on. So just a few things to say there. The New England grid, I think, is I can maybe put a link to it in the chat, but about 50% natural gas, a little over than that, only 2% oil, and close to 20% renewables, a number that we know will only continue to grow as the years go on. So the kind of concept that the grid is mostly fossil fuels, I mean, it's changing. Oh, Andrew, thank you for linking to the grid right there. So you can see the numbers right there and see the accuracy. You can actually see where it's coming from. But
didn't FIAS just, sorry to interject, but didn't FIAS recently just change their I don't know the proper term, but like the coefficient of, for electricity in New England just in the last year, because we are getting cleaner. Exactly. So it's not perfectly clean. Yeah. We're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, Michelle's referencing the concept of site to source energy, how you usually, when you go from the energy you're using on site in your home and you take into all the electricity losses from the plant, you usually have to multiply your on-site uses by a certain number to account for all that. It used to be over 3, it's now been reduced. I don't know the exact number that PHMass is using right now, but it keeps getting lower because of these changes, because we're using a higher percentage of renewables in our electricity grid. But I do want to ask this to the group, because I know for all of your towns, you're also thinking about this fossil fuel program, the no fossil fuel program. So I do want to ask a little bit about how you're approaching this question, because it comes up a lot, especially around not just the percentage of fuel use in the grid, but around the cost of natural gas versus electricity. So I'm just a little bit curious on how you're approaching this. If anybody, Lisa or Pat, you kind of want to jump in and talk about this.
I see
Well,
Hank's,
go ahead.
Hank's hand is raised. Go ahead, Pat.
No, Hank's got a better answer than I do. Let's.
Actually, I'm not going to answer that question. I don't feel I can. I was actually going to raise a question for people involved with various towns. At some point, I understood that DOER, through the Green Communities Program, we're going to be rolling out additional incentives for towns to, again, opt in for the opt-in code. Have you seen any of those incentives, and has it made any difference in the discussions?
The answer is no, it really hasn't. That we've been hinting the way you just did, that something like that may be down the road. But at least I'm not aware of anything that is specific enough to actually enter into it. And Arlington is starting from the position where they don't, I think they don't need that carrot necessarily to move. So it isn't really part of the conversation. The cost of electrification, it's a little bit, I mean, the data that we have had and that we've been working with ever since we got it from Brookline to begin with is that the actual costs are less once for almost all of the housing types. And that's what the Worcester study from DOER showed when they adopted this. They were pretty concerned about controlling costs and making sure that it wasn't uneconomic. And if you'll remember, they were responsible to an administration that was even more concerned than that. So I'm not exactly imagining that what DOER has come up with can be plausibly thought of as a radical solution. In terms of the building, Arlington has a hard time conceiving itself with its building as a major issue as far as ultimately the burden on the grid is concerned. We all know that the grid has got to develop, and it unfortunately have more time than we would like it to have to develop and to solve the various problems it has in order to be able to accommodate all of this. But you have to solve it all. You can't solve first one and then the other. You really have got to move in tandem. And that's what we're trying to do. And we're really just a little bit ahead of where the state as a whole is. Electrification, whether you like it or not, is part of the policy of the state. From Mass Save to every agency is in favor of electrification and pushing it, including DOER. There are issues about whether to do this by mandates or whether to do this by incentives. And some of that has to do with style. Some of it has to do with substance, and political acceptability. But in general, that's where we're going. And we just want to sort of be in the vanguard.
Yeah, I think that the points about, electrification, the cost of it being tied into the efficiency improvements that are being made at the same time is key. These aren't separate issues. We're doing this together.
As I recall, DOER, I think I remember hearing Paul Orman saying that the amount of extra burden on the grid, if everybody electrified and then also did the other things that are required to improve the building envelope, because you've cut back on the demand that much, he was estimating the additional amount of demand on the grid was only in the neighborhood of about 4%. That's a guess, but when you take those two things together and you don't just say we're going to have inefficient buildings and we're going to electrify them all, then suddenly the problem looks a lot more manageable.
So we have a few hands up now here. Now I'm going to go in order. Sandra, you can actually go first.
Okay. First, I want to say God bless veterans like Deb Crossley, that we have somebody who remembers the 70s and the crises involved in that, and that is not only an architect but a legislator now, and thank God we have folks like that in our corner. My question to the folks in the communities was about parking. Cambridge has done away with a requirement for off-street. I happen to be involved in developments in Cambridge, Somerville, Boston, and Newton as well. And I think we mentioned towns like Arlington, Watertown, Newton, Somerville. Does anybody see any of these towns moving away from the off-street, potentially the impact of eliminating off-street parking is a positive thing, that would contribute to higher density in terms of housing, more space for housing. Does anybody know of any plans to eliminate or mitigate that requirement? That's my question.
Well, I can say for Arlington, we have had proposals of that kind for the last several town meetings. And so that's kind of moving in that direction. It's not really, it's more of an incremental thing. It's not necessarily a consistent policy overall, but certainly there's a lot of attractiveness to that. And town meeting has generally been been in favor of taking baby steps. And if you take enough baby steps, you get grown-up steps, and that's kind of where it's going.
Yeah, I would also add that eliminating the requirement doesn't take away from the potential market need or goal or optimization. So just because it doesn't exist as a requirement doesn't mean that developers won't have parking, because they have to understand their target market. So I think it's definitely a thing that's out there. It's a work in progress. And just because you don't need any doesn't mean they're not going to have any, as they kind of evaluate what's real and what makes the most sense for the community they're focused on.
I will say Newton is working on zoning reform for our village centers, and part of that is going to go toward satisfying our MBTA communities requirements. We just spent most of last night talking about parking and whether and in what cases to eliminate parking minimums, and whether and in what cases, if any, to impose parking maximums. And it's an ongoing conversation, but it's ongoing for several years now, really, in the city council. And I would say the needle's moving a little bit, because our data shows clearly that we overbuild parking. Absolutely clearly that we overbuild parking. And the developers are seeing that too. And it's very expensive for the developers to build parking spaces. I always forget the numbers between, ground level parking and underground parking, but numbers like $100,000, $150,000 per space float around. I'm guessing that's structured parking, but that's pretty much what we have to do in Newton if we're going to have cut our parking requirements in half. I think it's a big deal for the future of our communities to be going in that direction.
I think I serve on my name's Catherine Duff. I'm an architect in New Bedford, Massachusetts. I also serve on the planning board and just stepped down as chair. I've been chair for the last 6 years. And in New Bedford, we often approve at planning a reduction in the parking requirement, but you have to, it's not just, you can't kick the can down the road. You've got to incentivize developers to come up with innovative solutions for transportation. We have transit oriented districts, TODs, in our city because our rail stations are under construction, the rail from New Bedford to Boston. And these districts are being targeted for affordable housing or workforce housing development in those areas. And, we're a historic city, so we have very limited space for parking. So what we're seeing is developers are getting very clever and creative and doing shared parking with other institutions like churches, or we have a lot of churches in our city that don't need the parking during the day or at nighttime, but need it on the weekends, et cetera. And we encourage that. We can't use it to approve your approval because it has to be part of your parcel, but we encourage those relationships and those agreements. And we just kicked off our master plan redo. So it's one of the zoning issues that we're looking at doing. But in general, we find that 0.6 is about the requirement for every one parking space required in housing. What we're finding in New Bedford, we really need about 0.6 spaces for those cars. So clearly the zoning regs are way too conservative. Hence why we approve so many reductions. And hopefully we'll adopt the blue lane.
Is the South Coast Rail going to be done and operational by the fall? I've been reading updates. Does it look like that's going to happen?
It looks like it may happen. It may happen. I am involved from the engineering aspect on the rail lines, so I know that they're ahead of schedule in that regard in terms of inspection and testing. The stations are under construction, so fingers crossed. It's actually going to happen. 20 years in the making.
At least.
Yeah, takes a lot of patience to be an architect practicing in New Bedford, Massachusetts. But there was a lot of chat in the comments about inspectional services. I will say, my hat goes off to them. I think they're overworked and underpaid, most of those departments. And it is so hard to keep current with all of the changes in the code.
Right.
And in Massachusetts, in New Bedford, we have the added burden of having, it's a blessing and a curse at the same time, but we have a national park right in our downtown on our waterfront. And we have a historic district right outside with the national park at the center of that historic district. And here we are trying to, build resilience to climate change, if you will. And it's very, very, very hard with these historic districts and with a national park. So something as simple as they don't allow solar panels in the historic district. So they're getting a lot of pressure, the Historic Commission, to change those regulations, or at least allow them in areas that wouldn't be so visible from the public way, et cetera, et cetera. But these are just really, really challenging issues for historic communities. There's no easy solution. I think it's all hands on deck. And the poor inspectional services are just sitting there trying to implement the new codes and ensure compliance with the new code. And it's, I think they need a lot of space to do some training and a lot of patience to ramp them up for enforcement of all this.
Well, great. This has been an excellent conversation. I'm seeing not too many new questions in the chat room. Does anyone else have any final questions? I don't want to let anyone go without getting your question asked. All right, don't see any hands up. I think this has been an amazing discussion. I think there's a lot of things that can go on from this. So I want to take one moment, and Lisa, I want to go back to you because I know with Zero Carbon MA, you've been putting together a lot of great resources, and you mentioned I think a Dropbox or a folder earlier, and I just want to make sure you get a chance to kind of share that and let people know what you made available.
Sorry, just putting on my mic. I'm
Sure.
actually looking for the link right now, and I will put it on the folder in the chat right now. It is, let's see, just let's get this to everyone.
You work on that. We also have the PHMass.org website, which we have all the links I showed today are on there. There was one hand that just went up and that went down, but if you want to ask your question, go ahead. Yeah, Maria.
Hi, I had a question in the chat. Is there any indication that Governor Healy will expand anyway beyond the 10 communities?
I can answer that question. We don't have any indication, but we have filed legislation that's been sponsored by Senator Comfort and Representative Sabadosa, both of Northampton, which is one of the waitlist communities. And so that's been introduced to the state legislature. It's also on this resources part of our website for anybody who wants to see it. And we would really welcome everybody's support. We can't make this a first come, first serve piece of legislation. And it shouldn't be a privilege to do this. It should be a right. So I want to thank Passive House for having me and this my wonderful panel here tonight. It's been really wonderful to speak with all of you. Thanks, Erin, for the invitation, and thank you all for coming and for the great questions and engagement. And please feel free to reach out if you need to be connected to people in other communities who've been working on this. And please pass the specialized code and continue to work hard to get our whole state fossil fuel free.
I'd like to extend my thanks as well and offer that we do have some materials in Newton that Ms. Berwick in particular has prepared. She's also done papers on, for example, why she's not worried about the capacity of the grid, having met regularly with ISO New England, some summaries of the different codes, and summary of the 10 communities requirements for any of you who might also be on the list. Thank you very much. Thank you, Aaron, for the invitation as well.
So I have hardly anything to add to what the previous two people said, except that it's been a delight to be able to be here, to be able to talk to you about what we're doing and to listen to about what other things are doing. And I love listening and watching the questions in the chat, and it gives us a lot more things to think about. But what I can say at least is stay tuned, because we haven't gotten to the finish line yet.
Right.
Well, good luck. I hope to hear good news soon. And Lisa, Pat, and Deb, thank you so much for taking part in this. And to everyone who attended this, thank you. And many of you out there, whether you were answering the chat room or otherwise, I know you're experts in various ways in a lot of this. And I'm going to turn to some of you for answers, and many people in all these towns who are considering this now are going to turn to all of us to kind of fill in some of these details and help educate folks. So we're going to keep this going. We'll see you guys next month for another one of our sessions. In the meantime, look through our website for links to all these great resources and the recordings of our past presentations as well. But take care. Stay safe out there. Good night.